Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Dr. Nicole, and today we're going to talk about something I think we can all use more of in our lives: fun. Now, before you tune out thinking that you have way more serious things to learn about and be concerned about as a parent, especially if your child has some major challenges, I want you to hang on because we're going to cover why fun is important. And it actually goes a lot deeper than you think. We're going to talk about how it supports our ability to better regulate ourselves and ultimately how it supports us in being better parents and better humans. It's relevant to all of us, especially during a time in the world when it seems like we're tapped out from all of the doom and gloom and stress around us. So to explore this topic with us today, I've invited Dr. Mike Rucker on the show. Let me tell you a bit about him. He's an organizational psychologist, behavioral scientist, and charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. He has been academically published in publications like the International Journal of Workplace Health Management, and his ideas about fun and health have been featured in all kinds of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Forbes, Vox, and on and on. He currently serves as senior leader at Active Wellness and is the author of the upcoming book, The Fun Habit, which will be available this coming January. Also want to mention that Mike is a parent, and he'll talk with us a bit about that. So welcome to the show, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So I want to hear a little bit of the backstory before we dive into all of the research and all the things that we need to understand about fun. I want a little bit of the backstory about how an organizational psychologist came to be focused on the importance of fun and the research behind that.
Yeah, so my origin story, unfortunately, it starts in a positive light. So I got early mentorship through a gentleman by the name of Michael Gervais. A lot of folks know him now because he has a popular podcast, but I was fortunate enough to get access to him early when he was still getting his clinical hours at the turn of the millennium. And so he became a mentor of mine and really introduced me to the work of folks like Charles Garfield and Csikszentmihalyi. So really got interested in the flow. And our relationship, I sort of graduated from that, but became a zealot of positive psychology right when Seligman was bringing that forth. And so, through serendipity, got invited to be a charter member of the International Positive Psych Association, and really, used all those tools effectively. I was really living a happy life using the concepts of mindfulness and gratitude to my advantage. I had also appropriated thought leadership from the quantified self movement, because at the time I met Michael in Los Angeles, but shortly after my wife and I moved to San Francisco, so I met Gary Wolfe and kind of became part of that. So not only was I consuming all this positive psychology, but I was also quantifying it. And this is before toxic positivity was a thing, but I think I was starting to bleed into that area. And long story short, this trifecta of unfortunate events, the biggest one being my little brother passed away suddenly from a pulmonary embolism. And I had been a long time endurance athlete. I was never really competitive at the professional level, but it was certainly a way that I mitigated my own anxiety. And shortly after, they weren't related, but a couple of months after Brian's passing, my brother, I found out I had advanced osteoarthritis, probably from an injury. And had to get a hip replacement, which meant I couldn't ever run again. And then the third one being, it wasn't unfortunate per se, but my wife had had my back for the last 6 years getting my doctoral degree. And she was offered an amazing job with Wrangler that brought us to North Carolina. So I had these two events that were a lot to take in. And then we were also being uprooted from our support network. But I'm like, I'm okay. I got all of these tools from positive psych. I'll find a way to be happy. And so again, the short version is, folks that chase happiness by the tail paradoxically become unhappy. We just know that now. But then it was emerging research, so I, like any good researcher, dug into what was available and, trying to find these tools of positive psych, that maybe I was missing, that, was the missing link to, why is it that as I try to become more happy, I'm becoming less happy? and found out that especially here in the Western world, this work comes from Dr. Arsmaus out of Cal Berkeley. Now it's been replicated by a lot of folks, but that it's not necessarily valuing happiness, because I certainly, I'm on, at the top of folks that still value happiness, but where it becomes toxic is if you're overly concerned about it, right? And so what we now know, to kind of fast forward, is that when folks are always worried about, hey, I want to be happy, they tend to perseverate on that identity crisis, right? And so we figure out where we are and we identify where we want to be, and we perseverate on that gap. And that's certainly what I was doing, right? Where mourning and melancholy was the appropriate response for, a sudden loss like that. Instead, I was trying to relinquish that. And so there's a few things Barbara Fredrickson brought and build, and then also, this idea of the hedonic flexibility principle. We now know that folks that try and limit their emotions, that's also a great recipe for weakening your well-being, right? It's okay to run to run a wide range of emotions. It's actually what our brain wants to do. So we have that flexibility, and we act appropriately at the appropriate time. So what does all that mean, right? And so to sort of answer your question and tie this into a bow, what I found was that emotionally, if we're in an area like a divorce or a challenging situation, which I know a lot of your listeners will find themselves in time to time, being in negative valence, what we call this negative affect or emotions where we might not necessarily feel good, but it's the appropriate response at the time, is fine. And then there's still ways to index activities that still bring joy and delight into your life, even if you're not in an area of your life where you want to identify, with positive emotions. And so, the crux of it is that we have a lot more agency and autonomy than we think, most of us. Obviously there are times where, folks aren't going to have that, right? And so I always try and make sure that I get that having those are sometimes from a place of privilege, right? But for the most part, when you unpack it, even folks that have an immense amount of duty, especially, in my generation, the sandwich generation, right, where we're not just caring for kids, but we're also caring for aging adults, which means that we don't have a ton of time. Generally, you can still pull a little bit of time off the table for yourself, right? This comes from Cassie Holmes out of UCLA, but we call it the Goldilocks number. There's 168 hours in your week. And so finding just an hour a day, so just 7 out of those 168 where you're at least taking a little bit of time for yourself for renewal is a start. And we find when people aren't doing that at all, that's when it becomes this downward spiral. So it's not just, this drudgery of your week after week. What happens is you lose the capacity to do the things that you need to do. And that's one of the most important findings,
You've raised so many important points there, and several follow-up questions I want to ask. I'll try to remember them as we go through, because I think one of the fundamental things you raised that's so important, especially for parents and the people listening to this show, is the idea of chasing happiness. And when that becomes our fixation of, I need to be happier, my kids need to be happy, my job, I'm not doing my job well as a parent unless my kids are happy. I need to be happy, my family needs to be happy, everybody around me needs to be happy, that chasing that actually makes us less happy. Like, I really want to shine a spotlight on it because it's so counterintuitive for people. And I meet parents every week in my clinic and in my communities online, moms especially, I think, who really believe and have been raised with this idea of, I'm a good person if I'm making sure the people around me are happy. I'm a good parent if I'm feeling happy about being a parent, if my family is happy, if my kids are happy. And the problem with that is, as you so beautifully talked about, like, real life intersects with that. And real life is not always about being happy. Like, there are unhappy things that happen to us. There are stressors, there's grieving, there's all of these things. And if our benchmark of being a good person, being a good parent, of our kids being good kids is happiness, whoa, we've got this gap there. And it's no wonder we're feeling stressed out and stuck and like we're not, meeting expectations all the time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And one of the things that I kind of stilled from my own work, so it's not inherent in the pages of the book, but that I've realized now, sharing ideas with folks like yourself, is that a lot of that comes from introspection, right? And so we know, one of the tools that's quite effective from positive psychology is savoring and gratitude, right? And so these are ways where we can extend the power of fun and pleasant experiences by holding them in our minds, right? But what you just described is introspection, where we're not taking action to change our environment, and we're taking something that was pretty awful in the moment and extending it because we're thinking about it, right? And so sometimes that's important if we need to unpack critical problems, right? Like, this isn't working. I either need help or I need to solve it myself. But when we're wallowing, then oftentimes that becomes quite problematic. And I'm sure in your work, I mean, it's the crux of CBT, right? We know that's why CBT is oftentimes more effective than pharmaceutical intervention, because it's those thought patterns that slowly but surely create that downward spiral. So it's not to say that we shouldn't have those, right? Because oftentimes we do need to unpack things. But at the same time, if we're doing it and it's sort of a broken record, one, we know mentally that it can contribute to ill-being, right? And then two, it's time wasted on not using that thought to be able to figure out, okay, well, how can I make things a little bit better? So it's a 1-2 punch that, sometimes can knock us on our butt, unfortunately.
And I think what it does, what I see, even for myself in my own life, and what I see for the families and the individuals that I work with, even in a counseling, type of setting, when we are just stuck in those thought processes around everything's not great, we're not feeling happy, or our kid is struggling and they're not happy. What we do then is we miss all of the happiness and the good things that actually are happening and exist, because we're so primed to be thinking about all the negative. And I think for parents who are listening, who are raising kids with significant challenges, where it may feel a lot of the time like there's a lot of negative, like nobody's happy. When we get stuck there, we actually do miss the moments of joy, the opportunities for fun, like the happiness that does exist, because, as you said, we're perseverating, we're stuck on the fact that we aren't where we think we should be, or, we're not as happy as we think we should be. And then we actually miss the happiness that is happening in our life.
Yeah, there's two things there that are sort of interesting to me from an academic standpoint. One, this comes from Dr. Timothy Wilson out of Virginia. As he studied this evolutionary idea that him and others, I think it also comes from Dan Gilbert out of Harvard, but we're primed not to think of positive things, right? Because if you do have an evolutionary slant, it makes sense, right? Like, thinking about happy things doesn't allow us to learn about what's going to kill us, right? But we're not in, saber-toothed tigers aren't coming to attack us anymore, right? And so what they have found, because, since this is something that's sort of spawned from evolution, are there benefits to thinking positive thoughts? And absolutely there are. We know that through the science of savoring. But as humans, we're really bad at it, right? So it does require practice. So this is one of those things where you do have to, whatever mindfulness practice looks like for you, you do need to be deliberate. And so oftentimes what I'll prescribe is, just adding it to your calendar, whatever it is. Facebook will do it for you, but why, mortgage that off to something that's pretty awful for you in the first place, right? And so, whatever the prompt is for you, some people like scrapbooking, that's not my thing. I do like to put little prompts in, but other folks, jars of things that do light you up. Again, you're going to find the good in your day to day, even if there's a bias towards, challenging events. They're going to be things that light you up. Why not figure out a way to sort of hold on to those longer? Because again, we have this predisposition, right, to hold on to the bad stuff, and it's not our fault. It's, unfortunately, there's an evolutionary slant to that. And then the other is that we do need to take some agency in co-creating those moments for us, right? And so what is it that we can do to relinquish that sense of duty? Because you had sort of brought it up, like a lot of us feel like, well, now this is our work. Well, yeah, that could be true. And like any type of work, oftentimes it's not going to be the most pleasant thing, right? I use this in a model that we don't need to get into. I call it agonizing, right? So it tends to be high negative effect and also energy zapping. But there are generally ways that you can look at that event and figure out how is there a way to make that more fun for me, even if it means relinquishing that thing. We talked about in the pre-interview. Oftentimes, especially if you're sharing these challenges with your social network, there are ways to organize your time. We're able to take a little bit more off the table by sharing duties with friends that might be in similar situations, or relinquishing the guilt of, it's okay to send your kid to camp. I get it. Your kids, and the problem is, right, like this, the situational awareness of any given individual is going to be different, and their situation is going to be different. So it's hard to prescribe like one intervention. But at the end of the day, your situation generally isn't unique. It might be small with regards to a shared experience, but I guarantee you it's not unique. And once you find others that can kind of help you carry the load, like, then some magic tends to happen. So
yeah, no, it's so true. And I want to start tying in the idea of fun here, because I think, and you can tell me in your research if this is wrong, but I think that people often confuse or conflate fun and happiness, in that they think, I can't have any fun, or I'm not really able to have fun until I'm feeling happy. Like sort of like happiness is a prerequisite. Well, if I'm not feeling happy or good about things, then I can't really have fun. And my understanding of really one of the things you're talking about and that the research talks about is actually that can get flipped around. And by creating moments of fun, by incorporating fun, by taking the action of fun in some way in our life, that supports then feelings of happiness. And yet I think a lot of people are waiting around thinking, well, I can't have any fun, like I'm miserable or I'm stressed or whatever. But actually what you're saying is it's by intentionally creating fun experiences, moments of joy, that we actually feel better.
Yeah. And so, like any good academic, you need to start defining terms, right? And so you're spot on, right? So we look at fun as an action orientation, and happiness is, in psychology, we call it subjective well-being for a reason, right? I mean, it's fleeting. It's something that really only exists in introspection. So someone literally, are you happy? And then you need to think about it, right? In kind of context. Fun is in the moment. I mean, it's rooted in mindfulness. So that's what makes it so beautiful. And it's really just, are you finding pleasure in this experience or are you not, right? We call it valence for whatever reason, but so right. Negative valence is things that aren't that fun or pleasurable, and positive valence are things that are fun and pleasurable. And so just architecting your, however you're engaging in a particular activity, if it's not pleasurable for you, how could you flip that, right? And sometimes you're not going to be able to, and that's okay. It is one thought that I meant to bring up before, so I'm going to close the loop on it. And that is another problematic thing is we try to solve our problems, right? So you had mentioned like, we're in it, and so when is this going to get better? And waiting around for that is as problematic as chasing happiness, because a lot of these things aren't going to be solved. But once you can relinquish that, like, okay, I get it. This is a situation, that's probably going to be persistent, right? I like to think, I use this metaphor of how do you build your accessibility ramp, right? Because there's so many folks, a lot of times I deal with aging well, right? In the context of wellness, and you'll see folks that are in chronic pain that, that look at, using a cane or building an accessibility ramp to their house as a scarlet letter, because then, that means that something's wrong with me. And once they do that, one, they save more time and they relinquish a lot of pain, because they realize like, okay, this is a situation I'm going to have to deal with. And no one really cares. It's, oftentimes this is like a perception issue that we keep inside that's only creating more pain, right? Through mental anguish. And so I like that metaphor, like, okay, accept the condition and then build your accessibility ramp, because no one cares, like figure out how to make it a little bit more pleasurable. And oftentimes relinquishing that guilt is the first step, or the sense of duty. Sometimes people don't feel guilty necessarily, but they're like, well, this is the hand I was dealt. It was, but you still have some agency and autonomy, to be able to co-create these experiences that might be more fun. Like, you're just dropping your child off to something to sort of get through the day. Is there a way to change that up where, maybe it's art therapy because you've always loved art, or maybe it's a dance class where you can create because you were a dancer. Like, what is it? What are these activities that maybe will be helpful, as an intervention, but then also light you up inside a little bit because it will draw you back into something that was fun for you, whatever that is.
I love what you said about we get stuck in the problem and trying to solve the problem, and that actually most of the problems we deal with in life are inherently unsolvable, or at least not totally solvable. And that rings so true for anybody who's parenting a kid with significant needs that are going to be ongoing. Some of you listening maybe have kids who you'll work through some remediation, some therapies, whatever. They'll be on a, developmental track where they will move on and become independent. And some of you are parenting kids where this is the reality of your life. Yes, you're working on things. Yes, you're doing therapies, but your child is not going to become 18 or 21 and not need you. This is not a solvable problem from the standpoint of, well, at some point I'll have this all fixed and then I can go on. But we sort of act like that, right? Like, well, I can't do things for myself, or I can't bring joy into my life until I have this thing fixed and solved. Well, that's a recipe for lifelong depression, because some of these things are not going to be solved. We have to learn how to live with them. And what you're saying is how to bring some joy to ourselves and to our kids in the process, because this isn't something that's time limited, that's just going to get solved.
That's absolutely right. You nailed it on the head. That is when you wait around for something to change, right? Like, my brother's not coming back. For folks that are going through divorce, that's not going to change. You're going to need to adapt to this new normal. If you have a situation like what you described, there are going to be ebbs and flows, but it's not a solvable thing where, again, there's this point B that you'll arrive. And, it ties into the broader big tent that we talked about, like happiness, as cliched as isn't a destination where all of a sudden, like, now moving forward, you're in a fairy tale. That's just, unfortunately, life has its ups and downs, but you can bias yourself towards the ups, whatever that is for you. And so for some people, that's going to mean that they need to build in the psychological safe space that allows them to do that, because the rest isn't fixable, right? But to wait around to experience a little bit of joy in life, you nailed it on the head. We know this empirically replicated over and over again, that it will eat you to the point where even if duty is tied to the highest value in your identity, you're going to lose the capacity to be able to do that. And then that will sink you. It's like tying an anvil to your leg, right? And so oftentimes when people are stuck, like, what, to your point, Yaman, you hit it right when we open, like, okay, great. The fun guy, like, I don't, this just isn't going to work. Well, then tie it to the fact that you are going to be your best self with regards to what you value. And that is the sense of duty and contributing to the loved ones, within your inner circle, because being able to have more resilience and more ability to do whatever it is you do is only going to help those around you. And so by living a life devoid of pleasure, it incapacitates you in so many different aspects, not just mental well-being, but also physical well-being. Like, eventually you're going to break, and then you're going to be the one, that ultimately needs the help. So
when we're falling apart, we can't be there for our kids, right?
Yeah.
Or anybody else who needs us. I want to drill down a little deeper and really sort of define, you've touched on it, but I really want to be clear for people, because I think sometimes when we think about the word fun, or we think about play, or we think about, it conjures up ideas of, oh, I need to plan an elaborate, day of self-care. I need to plan an elaborate trip with my kids, or, oh my gosh, you're telling me I got to be out in the yard after dinner, like playing and having fun with my kids for 3 hours in the yard. Like we think of these huge things. And I think what you're talking about with fun, and you've touched on it, like moments that bring us joy, that's a different thing. I mean, yes, it can be fun to plan a day at the amusement park. Yes, it can be fun to plan a week-long vacation. Well, that's actually only fun most of the time if we do that without our kids. But anyway, but it doesn't have to be those elaborate things. And in fact, what you're talking about is these daily, like little pockets and moments, right? So can you give some examples and just sort of define that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, the way, so again, it comes down to valence, right? We know, things are either not pleasurable or pleasurable, but what I often have folks initially do is just look at the 168 hours in their week. And I have this simple model called the play model. It's easy to Google, just Rucker play model, pop right up. And it stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding, right? And so the pleasing and living quadrants are activities that bring us that joy, and the agonizing and yielding are ones that don't. And so just categorizing your activities within those 4 quadrants tends to be a fairly good sorting tool to just become initially mindful, because oftentimes that's the low-hanging fruit, right? Like, so the yielding one means activities that aren't, when we think about them critically, aren't fun, but are really easy for us to do. So it ends up being ways of pacifying discomfort, right? Like a big
scrolling social media.
There you go, right? Or relationships out of convenience, where you're like, or oftentimes binge watching stuff. So, people will jump on me like, well, I love my Netflix show. And so I'm not villainizing that. Like if you spend, an hour with your partner engaging in something, one of my favorite shows is Lost, right? Because it's about, and like, so sitting there, I would watch it with my now wife and a bunch of friends, and we would unpack it for another hour. That's fine. But if you're watching a show week after week and someone asks you like what happened and you can't answer it because, it was just a way to sort of zonk out on the couch. And here's another paradoxical thing, is that oftentimes we're like, well, I just need that time for renewal. But what we know is that you're actually doing something that is enjoyable, one, you sleep better, but 2, you have more resilience. It's, it takes a couple weeks, similar to any sort of psychological intervention, to kind of see that lift. And we don't know exactly why, right? Because neurochemistry is complicated. But what we do know is once you start to enjoy your time, you have more resilience. And then that will start, instead of this downward spiral, build an upward spiral. Like you'll start to want to do more fun stuff. You'll start to get more organized around your time. Even if you have ADHD, you'll, because this works for, non-neurotypical folks as well. You just get it like, oh, okay, I wasn't using my time wisely, right? And again, these are really simple interventions. And that's why sometimes when things are simple, they're the hardest things to implement, right? Because one, you can push them off the next week. Like, oh, well, that's so simple. I just won't, I'll do it when I have time, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think the yielding thing, like what you're talking about there, that's tricky, especially in a 24/7 tech world that we're in. I see this in kids and teens that I work with, as well as adults. It's easy to think in the moment that it's making you happy to sort of zone out and watch YouTube videos or scrolling up, but actually the data is really clear that the more we get sucked into doing that, actually the less happy we are. It's passive. I think probably it doesn't, kids would say, or even some adults would say, oh, but that makes me happy, or that helps me in the moment. But actually what it does is just avoids, right? It's like short-term, avoidance, but really it's not helping us be happier. And there's no agency, there's no creating of something that then fuels, being and feeling more positive. And all we need to do is look at the rates of depression and anxiety in teens and young adults as it correlates to the amount of time they spend on social media in particular, to go, oh, wait, yeah, that actually is not something that's bringing a lot of value to us.
Yeah, I did a deep dive into that, especially for the book, and it was fascinating. That's why I made the admission a little bit earlier, but neuroscientists now hate calling dopamine, the pleasure neurochemical, because we just know it's not now, right? And so what we think is happening, and we've, not me, but folks a lot smarter than me, is we know folks get excited, right? This comes from gambling studies, but now has been replicated with social media, is that it's that anticipation of a variable reward, right? We're going down, and as we scroll, like, what's going to be the next little thing that lights me up? And so we know dopamine's getting released. We think that dopamine's evolutionary purpose was to get us excited so we would learn something, right? So that's why it is a high arousal, but it's not very pleasurable. And there's obviously a component too of oxytocin. We don't know what it is, but there is no oxytocin released. We feel this sort of saccharine sweet sense of connection because we see folks, but we know that oxytocin isn't getting released unless we have that social connection. So that's where it's getting weird, and like we're getting deep into the weeds because Zoom sometimes gets vilified. But if you can see someone's eyes and these mirror neurons, you can still feel empathy that's not there with social media, when we know it's fake. So it's a complicated sort of mix. But to put a pin in what we do know now is that you're exactly right. We displace this discomfort because we're bored, right? Or we're lonely or whatever it is. So we feel this fake sense of connection, or this fake sense of entertainment, and it's not filling us up. And so the way we could look at it is we're not building any equity, right? When we take the time to connect with friends, to actually pick up the phone and ask them what we're doing, this is equity that we know pays dividends later on because we build resilience. We're less lonely. The boredom, if we do get bored, we can think about those good times with friends. We just don't get any of those benefits with social media, unfortunately. But to your point, we feel like we have, which is so unfortunate. I mean, we're really starting to figure out how damaging this stuff is.
I think so. I think 10 years from now, we're going to be in a totally different world in terms of our understanding. Unfortunately, we will have sacrificed, a generation of young people in the meantime, who we're going to have to undo some of the damage with that. But yeah, it's fascinating. And we're all part of the big human experiment going on with that, right? I mean,
I think a little bit of grace, right? Like
absolutely.
I'm a parent.
Yep.
I realized it with my youngest. We had to pacify him because we were both working. And so we are the product of his bad habits right now.
Yep.
And we don't want to make it punitive. So anyone listening, I'm not throwing stones at you because I'm living in a big glass house.
Right. Well, and I say all the time, we are the first generation of parents raising kids in this world of all this. We don't have previous generations or models to look at and go, well, how did our parents do this, right? We're trying to figure this out and navigate it for ourselves. At the same time, we're supposed to be guiding, and helping our kids to navigate it. It's tough. Yeah, absolutely. But I think, the reason I wanted to jump on that, and I want to get back to the play model, but I wanted to spotlight that because I think, especially now, there are a lot of moms spending a lot of time on social media, and there's the good and the bad, there's the connection and the being able to meet people that you may not in your own community who can relate to the struggles you're going through with your kids or with whatever. But I think it's that being mindful of maybe which quadrant that's really falling in. Is that serving to be action oriented and relational and filling my cup up? Or when I'm really honest with myself, is it actually just, allowing me to avoid discomfort and kind of numbing out and not really rejuvenating me? And I think that's different for each of us, right? But to just be aware of it. And that's what I love when you talked about that play model and the 4 quadrants. I was like, wow, that's a great exercise for each of us, just to step back and say, of all the stuff I'm doing every day and every week, how much of it is falling into it was the agonizing, right? Agonizing and yielding categories versus the other. I think probably there's a lot of us that would be maybe uncomfortable to see the reality of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, oftentimes there's it's a great way to start because you identify low-hanging fruit, right? And, if you don't even feel like doing that, just simply, now I think due to social pressure, both Android and Apple allow you to see how much time you've spent on these apps. I mean, like if you want just a taste of how this feels, go ahead and take a look because it's always humbling. And to circle back again, similar to the example of consuming entertainment, would say you're spot on there, right? These are great tools for connection. Oftentimes the lens I'll look is what you're doing for betterment. Is it to acquire information? Are you using it as a way to connect to, your inner circle? And so, it's facilitating the growth of your personal tribe, or are you really doing it to displace discomfort? And generally, most people that, can be honest with themselves can tell that fairly quickly. Again, if you kind of scroll the hashtag with regards to fashion and, the first 15 minutes were great because you were, snipping ideas and things. But then an hour's passed and you can't remember the last 45 minutes. That's a good litmus test. Again, because that's the thing, we're taking a bit of a turn here, but that's another important thing about time, right? Is that when we when we keep displacing discomfort that way, and so that we're not actively making new memories, that's when time starts to go by fast. And that can also be debilitating, right? Because then we're not able, we don't have any of these moments that we can savor that really are the essence of reminiscing. This work comes from Bonnie Ware, but a lot of folks have taken her work and created academic work around it. And so we know that folks that just kind of live their life through others, oftentimes at some point, whatever it is, whether it's through palliative care or even earlier, an immense amount of regret will overwhelm them. And so, taking charge now and building up some, defenses against that become really important, because you don't want to break.
Well, I think, what I think is really interesting about us focusing on this element of it, of social media and tech use. First of all, it's applicable to us and our kids, but also it is a bit of low-hanging fruit if we're honest with ourselves about how we're using it and the amount of time we're spending. It is low-hanging fruit, because a lot of times I think the objection to the idea of how can we work more fun or enjoyment or even rest and rejuvenation, well, I don't have the time. Well, when we're honest with ourselves about how we're using some of this time, suddenly we go, well, what would it look like if I scrolled for 10 minutes less and used that 10 minutes? How could I use that 10 minutes in a way that would fill my cup, that would bring some joy or some engagement to me? And I think what a great exercise to do with our kids too. Like, hey, what would happen if we spent 5 minutes less on YouTube? What could we do with that 5 minutes that would give us a boost, that would rejuvenate us, that would help us feel joy? Like, it strikes me that that's a really tangible way that we could look at that.
Yeah. And there's some, really easy ways to do that. Like I would say more in increments of 15 minutes.
Sure.
But, and I don't, just because 5, 10, we'll think, we'll let that time pass just thinking. But, if you've seen a friend that you haven't talked to for a year and thought, like really missed that person, just pick up the phone, and oftentimes there'll be an inversion because neither one thinks that they have the time to connect. But remind them that's what needs to happen, and you'll build a habit. I've seen it time and time again. Another is if you keep getting FOMO through this, again, sort of, this paradox of it ultimately, social media leading to this negative valent state. Use that 15 minutes to plan whatever it is. If it's a hobby, let's say it's knitting, and you keep, looking at knitting Instagrammers because you love it, and so that lights you up, but you're, I just don't have time for it. Like,
you're not actually knitting.
Yeah, exactly. Or, if it's a vacation, start planning it. Like, if you don't have the money, because, sometimes this is, start trying to figure out, research how can you either reframe that, like, so that you could do something locally, something that's affordable, or if it is affordable, but it's not something that you could prioritize with time, like start to figure out what are the things that you need to get done to do it. And so those are two different ways, right? If it's social connection that you're kind of trying to solve with social media, then just call that person. Right. And then, if it's something that has to do with activity, it's like, oh, I wish I was doing X. And, it's a way to connect with X. Again, to your point, over time, if you replace it, you probably could do X in some form. And so just get more mindful, use your agency and autonomy to take steps forward, to actually do that thing. And again, it's that simple. It's another one of those simple things when you're like, well, this is how easy it is. You know, we've talked about guilt. We've talked about a sense of duty. There's also, I don't want to look stupid.
Yeah, right.
Because it is, a lot of these things are like just a shift, and you get embarrassed that you let it go on for that long, you know? And so I find that, you know, I've fallen victim to that too. Sometimes when things are so simple, you're like, I don't want them to be that simple, but they are.
Right, that's right. Yeah, because then we have to look at why we're not actually doing them, right? And also, if we think that something's going to be really complicated and, you know, long, then it's like, oh, I can use avoidance then, right? Oh, I don't have the time. When it's like, wow, okay, I actually do have the time and it's simple. Then we actually have to face doing it, which is tricky.
Well, and I fall victim to catastrophizing, just so that people know, like,
Sure.
you know, this isn't something where I'm a guru on the top of the mountain, you know, like I will be like, oh, well, yeah, but if I do this, you know, like, and I'll just have to roll it back. You know, again, I've gone through my own cognitive behavioral work. And so, you know, I'll just reframe it like this, you know, this is one of the worst possible outcomes. And again, it's probably, you know, yeah, it might happen, but then just try again. Right. And so, a lot of it's self-experimentation. Like once you do finally get on board that, yeah, I do need to take a little bit of time off the table for myself, or figure out, you know, the activities that I'm doing, like how could I make it so that I'm enjoying them, you know, with the folks that where I'm engaging the activity. You know, then it becomes, you know, you start doing these self-experiments, and to be honest, you know, maybe I'm a geek about it, but I also find that, you know, adds more value. You know, it's a contributor to the upward spiral, because you're like, okay, well, that didn't really work out. You know, I borrowed this from Carl Dweck. I'm sure, you know, you've talked about that, but, you know, once you get into that growth mindset too, right? These setbacks, you can laugh about them, right? Like, oh, well, that didn't go right, you know.
Which is actually great modeling for our kids too. And it's striking me as we're talking about this, like if you have a child who very easily gets sucked into negative mindset, negative thinking, everything, you know, is wrong or bad or drudgery or whatever, that these things to model for them and to work with them on are really important for them, and shifting that mindset too. I want to just touch on one more thing before we wrap up, and that's the idea. Before the show started, you used this term. We were just having a conversation. You said co-creating fun, and I think that's really interesting to think about in the realm of family dynamics and even parent-child relationships. And it just struck me because you were talking about sort of like how can we leverage this, be more efficient with our time, and do things that will help us. Parents, you know, often are aware that spending quality time with their kids is important. Some parents have guilt around not doing that. It strikes me that creating, you know, opportunities for some fun or some joy together is a great efficient way of supporting everybody in the family system, and you know, just being efficient with how we're using time and spending quality time together. And I wonder if either, you know, as a researcher or as a dad, if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the two things that I've found, again, supported by the research, this comes from Dr. Dunn out of Toronto, I believe. But we do know that the happiest parents tend to be selfless parents, right? So I kind of start there. So, you know, this sense of duty isn't necessarily selfless, right? And so I want to be careful here, because this doesn't necessarily mean that you give all yourself away, right? But so the reason I bring that up is I think when you are co-creating activities for your kids, starting with them, you know, as a starting point, like letting them be the North Star, right, is important. Now, with that said, the important caveat is it's not fun if you're both not having fun, if you're not finding pleasure, right? And so simply sitting down with your kid and negotiating the same way they would with their own friends, again, is a simple step, but you never see it, right?
Yeah.
And
boy, that's true.
We have reasons for that, right? I mean, as adults, for us to be emotionally mature, we need heuristics, right? And so we won't geek out on the science, but it should be obvious, right? We have all of this incoming information coming at us, and to be able to survive as adults, we need these bumper rails, right? So oftentimes we'll just relinquish that control because we know what the task is at hand to watch over our kids and make sure they have fun. Just taking that extra step and reminding yourself that both of you guys can have fun within any given activity. So if you don't want to play Candyland for the 10th time, or for my kid, it's, another hour of Minecraft because I'm kind of done with Minecraft, I can negotiate with him. What is something that we can both do that's fun? Right now, it's going to the movies, something as simple as that. And again, if that was mindless, then yeah, that would be in the yielding category. But because we were really liking it right now, we just went and saw Buzz Lightyear and unpacked it and talked about science and STEM type things afterwards. That's something that we both really enjoyed, where again, if I had kind of relinquished control and said, okay, yeah, let's do this Minecraft thing, that hour would have sucked for me and not been renewing. And so it's as simple as that. But, oftentimes we need to be reminded to take that extra step that we have, it's through transactional analysis, right? Like we can allow ourselves to be parents and children at the same time. And oftentimes we forget that because again, and this is showing grace, right? We've kind of needed to have those types of skills to be an adults. And so to be able to step back into, play with your children while still maintaining a sense of like, well, I have this duty to be a parent, takes extra work, but it only, the good part is it only takes an extra minute or two. Right?
Oh, I love that, man. That is such a great takeaway of how can we both figure out something or a way to do this that will bring us both joy, that we'll both have fun with. And it's modeling so many important things. And I think like right there, as you're talking, I'm like, that would reduce a ton of resentment that parents end up living with because they end up resenting the time with their kids because they hate doing the same things over, especially if you have a kid who really gets stuck on the same thing. And this idea that, oh, wait a minute, we actually can negotiate how to spend this time together so that we both enjoy it. Like, man, that's awesome.
And like the last thing there, because I know we got to go, but like, and this is a little bit provocative, but oftentimes, again, I don't work with parents a lot, but this does seem to be common, are these relationships out of convenience where they're like, I just don't like, I did it because, but so where does your best friend live? Well, they're like 15 minutes more away. Like, really? So, extra 30 minutes where that 4 hours will be really a great time. You're shaving off 30 minutes so that 3 hours is a horrible time.
Right.
Like, I get it. It doesn't feel great to break up with, like, but so there's all sorts of like low level tactics if you're just a little bit more honest with yourself and take a little bit of time of realizing you have a little bit more control in the situation, especially when you relinquish the fact that you can be dutiful and still have, a fun life. And again, not necessarily like it being happy time, right? It's just like, how do you make it a little bit more pleasurable so that it's not something that's soul sucking?
Which, ultimately makes us better for our kids when we feel a sense of duty and a sense of what it means to be a parent that really is soul sucking and creates resentment and all of that. That's sort of the antithesis of good parenting and what the experience of being a parent should be. So, so many really interesting things to think about here. You've raised a lot of great points, given us some really practical tips. I know that your book, The Fun Habit, it's available for pre-order now. I know it won't be coming out until January of 2023, but I'd love for you to tell people where they can learn more.
Yeah, so it's available wherever you buy books. So thanks for allowing me to plug that. And then if you're interested in the science of fun, I write about it at michaelrucker.com.
Yeah, you've got just lots of great blog posts. I really, it was sort of like I went down a rabbit hole on your website of things and great. So I encourage everybody to go there. Mike, this was such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a true delight.
And thanks as always to all of you. We'll catch you back here next time.